Hello and welcome to Nostalgia Trip, the show where we here at GameSpot look back at our favorite games from yesterday and see if they still hold up today. I'm Mike Mahardy here with Jean-Luc, and we are going to look back at one of our favorite series to the second game, which started a lot of trends we see today. Like moths to a flame, numerous games have tried to mimic the brilliance of the first Dark Souls. Upon its release in 2011, From Software's action RPG popularized its blend of deliberate combat, punishing difficulty, and maze-like world design. It refused to hold your hand, opting instead to unfurl mysteriously before you, daring you to venture farther. In GameSpot's original 2011 review, Kevin Van Ord called it a landmark game, destined to be loved and talked about by anyone who has the pleasure of unraveling its mysteries. So now, with Dark Souls Remastered out in the open, we're returning to Lordran to see if these words ring true. All right, so Jean-Luc, you are a huge fan of From Software's portfolio. Dark Souls Remastered just released a few weeks ago, and it was a good chance for us to go back, and we thought we'd look back at whether it is still worth playing today in its remastered form or in general. What is it like going back to Dark Souls, especially now that we've played the two sequels and Bloodborne that's also from, it's kind of From Software's cousin game?
Right. I mean, I think the biggest thing is the pacing.
Yeah.
It's like immediately different. Bloodborne was a way faster game. And then Dark Souls 3 went back to the slower pace, but it's still much faster. There's more of an emphasis on rolling. There's a greater emphasis on managing multiple enemies. You go back to Dark Souls 1, and it feels a lot more simple, where it's like typically it's all about encounters with single enemies, or maybe two or three, and kind of managing them. Mm-hmm. There's a lot more emphasis on shield combat as a viable strategy. You can still do rolling, but I feel like it's just deliberately slower than kind of the later games, but I don't think that's a bad thing. It's just a different way than it's designed.
Right, it's kind of funny to see how, like you mentioned, Dark Souls 3 kind of borrowed something from Bloodborne that made that combat faster paced. It just takes patience, which isn't always, something you see in more modern games. I want to talk about the boss fights, because that's also, like, specifically when we're talking about combat. With the Dark Souls, the Soulsborne games, the bosses are kind of like the stars of it when you actually reach them. What are some of your favorite bosses from Dark Souls that you've remembered since playing this game back in 2011 that have stuck with you?
Oh man. So I think what struck me when I first played the game was that there were bosses that were difficult and bosses that were like a spectacle. Mm-hmm. So like a good spectacle example would be Sif the Wolf. It's not necessarily a hard fight, but it's like a really, like the arena and the setup for it, and then like the way Sif slowly starts limping as you're playing it, that's a fight that just feels like that stuck with me. It felt impactful.
Yeah.
It felt like they're getting the storytelling in there. Mm-hmm. But then of course there's crazy hard fights like Ornstein and Smo, which is probably one of the more infamous Dark Souls bosses.
Yeah.
That's the make or break moment in this game, and it still kicks my ass. I was like, oh, I got it. I'm coming back. I've got all these other Dark Souls games. It's still hard. That fight is still just gonna completely kick your ass.
Because that's not the first time in the game that you fight, two bosses at once. You do the Bell Gargoyles earlier on. Right. And that is kind of first a really strong test of your positioning, especially when one of the Bell Gargoyles is breathing fire and the other one's just swinging with its halberd. You really have to worry about positioning, which is huge in any Soulsborne game, but especially Dark Souls. But then, Ornstein and I say Smog, that's just what I hear in my head. Ornstein and Smo, it's so indicative of Dark Souls to me. And you mentioned kind of all the storytelling in the combat. I do want to talk about the world and level design, which is something you and I always gush about when it comes to Soulsborne games. When you've played Bloodborne by now, or even Dark Souls 3, you're used to the way that finding a shortcut back to a bonfire or lantern in the case of Bloodborne is just as big a deal, almost, to me at least, as beating a boss. You can get back to it easier. You can save all the souls. Obviously, a big trope or a big conceit of these games is that you lose all your experience when you die, unless you can retrieve it before dying again next time. And Dark Souls, specifically the first one, is interconnected on a much
bigger scale.
Like that's what makes Dark Souls still, I think, stand apart from the rest of the sequels is the level design and the kind of like spiral structure where everything's sort of like layered on top of each other and you can see everything. And I think Demon Souls was much more like broken up into 5 different sections that were kind of like linear, and then Dark Souls 2 is very, very linear. It's much more of like this kind of like flat, like plane.
Yeah.
Bloodborne's probably the closest, I'd say, to getting back to what Dark Souls did, but even then, it still feels a little bit broken up. Same with Dark Souls 3.
Yeah.
Like Dark Souls 1, everything feels so connected. There's this great part where when you start in Firelink, you have immediate access to, well, I can go down to the New Londo ruins, I can go to the catacombs, I can go up to the Undead Burg, and then when you finally get to Blighttown and you have to get back up, you can take that shortcut and it gets you to the Valley of the Drakes, and it has an immediate shortcut which gets you right back to Firelink. So just the way everything kind of connects back to each other through those shortcuts is something that I think the other Souls games have never quite done to the level.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason why this one works is because it doesn't give you fast travel until over halfway through the game, which is a contentious thing. I know a lot of people don't like that. I think it makes you really like connect with the world and like memorize exactly how it's laid out.
I go one step further. I wish that didn't even happen. I wish you didn't have fast travel at all.
At all?
I think it would fit the game better. I mean, I know that fast travel is very helpful, especially when you're replaying the game. If you're going back with Dark Souls Remastered and you know the game really well, you'll be like, oh, thank God, now I have fast travel between bonfires. I think it fits the game's identity more if you didn't have fast travel.
Yeah, I would agree. I kind of get why they did it. I think it's because when you get to the second half, it opens up where you're supposed to kind of go back to these previous areas that you need to unlock, and you can tell they were a little rushed for time. Lost Izalith is an infamous example of an area that's like not done, and you can tell when you're playing it. And so I bet you there was at some point in their original vision was to not have any fast travel at all.
It's so amazing to look back at Dark Souls and go back today especially. I haven't played Dark Souls maybe since it released in 2011. It was weird. I remember getting it through GameFly, and I hadn't played Demon Souls. I knew what Dark Souls was. I knew who From Software were as a group. But I finally got Dark Souls and I started playing it, and like we mentioned, the lack of guidance felt so refreshing. They have gotten away from that a little bit. I think you put it really well when Dark Souls 3 came out, you put it really well. I think you said Dark Souls, this was before From Software completely knew what they were doing, and it kind of shows, like, they didn't always go by the rules in the first, I mean, they don't in general, but like Dark Souls especially, you can tell, they did not give a shit where they were guiding you at all.
Yeah. When you hit 3 and you've played all of these games, you start to realize that there's like certain formulas and safety nets that they're like, oh, well, you know, the bonfire is probably going to be here and the shortcut's going to be there. Or the way bosses interact, where you're going to have this type of boss. Like there's sort of like an archetype of Souls type bosses that you can expect. And I think Dark Souls, and especially like Demon Souls for sure, they were like a little more experimental and didn't necessarily because they didn't have all these fan expectations of like, well, it has to have this, this, and this.
Sure.
So it felt like they were a little more free to get weird with some of the bosses and stuff like that. Like the Moonlight Butterfly, for example, is like such a weird boss, and I absolutely love it. Or things like the PvP, stuff like that is like so weird.
You just mentioned PvP and stuff, and I think I want to ask, is this game worth going back to today? And I think obviously if we haven't kind of hinted at what we think already, a reason it's worth going back to today still, 7 years after it released, you can kind of feel like it's timely. And you were saying you didn't get that when you first played Dark Souls.
Right, I played it a couple of years after, so I got the messages, those kind of stick around. But the PvP stuff, I didn't get as much of it. You get a little bit, but it's usually at that point you're playing with people who have like New Game Plus 7 characters and they're just here to troll you.
Yeah.
It's really refreshing playing the game with people, and you get to see all the little touches. So for example, something a lot of people probably don't know is when you ring the bell, when you have to ring the 2 bells at the beginning of the game, that actually will ring out to everyone else who's playing. So when you're playing the game at the beginning, if you hear a bell ring, that is because another player has rung the bell, and you actually get a free humanity from it. Tiny little stuff like that the game just like never tells you. That's really cool. But then you have stuff like, oh, I'm gonna go fight this boss, and you see like 18 like summon me signs, and that's like, I think that's great that like people have the ability to like, oh, I'm having really trouble with this boss. Oh, there's tons of people that are willing to help me out. And you have all the covenants. Like, I think they did a better job like explaining the covenants in the later games, but this game still has like that level of depth and variety in the covenants. So you have like a covenant that's designed entirely to troll people. Like, you're supposed to get in there and just kill people and like mess their day up. And then you have this item you can get where you can, when someone does that to you, you can mark them in a book.
Yeah.
And then if you have that book and you join this, the Moonlight, the Dark Moon Covenant, if you join the Dark Moon Covenant, you are like an avenging spirit who
like
goes
bounty
through
hunters
that.
almost.
Yeah, you're like a bounty hunter. You go through the book and you find a person, you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get that guy.
Yeah.
And then you invade their world and you kill them, you get revenge on that person. And so like, having these covenants that like set up these different roles you can play becomes almost a game in itself. Like, you can basically get to a point in that game where you're like good enough and you can be like, I'm gonna now play a character who just helps people fight bosses because I want to do that, or I'm gonna help avenge people who get killed, or I'm gonna go kill people, or I'm just gonna do PvP arena fights. Like, that is probably one of the most like underrated aspects of the Souls series, and I think it is just as good in this one as it is in the other ones, and I'm really happy that people are like finally have a chance to properly experience it. In the original version of the game, some of the covenants were actually broken. Like the Gravelord Servant covenant wouldn't really work that well, and even then a lot of people weren't in it. And now there's actually like a ton of people in it right now if you're playing the remaster, and that's great because it's like, cool, here's like a part of the game that's just straight up didn't work, or people didn't get to experience, so now you get to.
I think we both agree 100% it's worth going back to.
Totally.
Even with Dark Souls 2 available, 3, Bloodborne. I love Bloodborne. I used to say Bloodborne was my favorite Soulsborne game. Replaying Dark Souls, I'm almost tempted to put Dark Souls 1 at the top, for me at least. 2 is still a bottom, then 3. But Dark Souls 1, I think, after, like in hindsight, in a post-Bloodborne, post-Dark Souls 3 world, I think Dark Souls is my favorite still.
It probably depends on the day you ask me. I think I do like the level design more in Dark Souls and sort of the way it's all connected. But there is something about the like aesthetic of Bloodborne that I like more, and that's just like a personal preference. But
Victorian, Gothic.
Exactly,
kind of
like I love that stuff. But there's something about Dark Souls that I still think is unique and stands apart. Like when you think about like a franchise like this, typically the early, like the first game, maybe like holds up the least. Especially like a genre, right? Like Dark Souls, you could say like created a genre. And technically Demon Souls created a genre, I know, but Dark Souls popularized that genre and created a lot of things that people are like using today, and games like
the Surge, Lords of the Fallen,
Neo, stuff like that. And so whenever that happens, typically the first that original game feels very dated. You think like Gears of War 1 was a great game at the time, feels like really dated now. Games like Doom 3, like that were like these kind of early examples like scripted shooters, they feel super dated. Dark Souls 1 doesn't feel dated in the way those games are, and I think it's because there are things that it does that later Souls games never did, like the way its level is designed and the lack of fast travel. There are obviously some things that don't hold up, like some of the UI improvements in the later games are obviously like really welcome changes, but I do think this game holds up surprisingly well in a way that I think other games wouldn't hold up.
As a remaster, it's a bit noticeable to see like a lack of shadows. Especially like I was telling you, I think the one time I really remembered, I was like, oh yeah, I'm playing a remaster of a 2011 game. In Darkroot Garden, the trees, if you looked at them from the side, they look like plus signs with like leaves drawn on. That was when I really noticed it. But outside, I mean, like it's smoother now. If you're playing Dark Souls Remastered, I would definitely say play this as opposed to the actual original game on 360 PS3, whatever. And obviously, again, you get that community feeling from everybody playing at the same time. So if you played Dark Souls 2, 3, Bloodborne, Neo, Lords of the Fallen, any of the games that were inspired in part by Demon Souls but by Dark Souls popularizing them, it is still very much worth returning to Dark Souls, especially with Dark Souls Remastered. You'll be able to play it with thousands of other people that are just getting into it for the first time or the 10th time. But anyway, this was Nostalgia Trip in our look back 7 years after at Dark Souls, which released in 2011. Still very much worth playing today, and we highly recommend it.